Now, I might venture to suggest that the prophecy of Malachi, its few chapters, is relatively well known amongst our community. It's relatively straightforward to read. It's not terribly complicated, although there's a couple of expressions which we're going to find a little bit challenging this evening. But by and large, it's something that we can read and readily understand at face value. And one of the things which I think characterizes the prophecy of Malachi is the directness of speech which he employs. It's strident, it's forthright, it's really, really focused and direct. And it's to you, as it were. He's direct with blunt questions, and it is both critical and unflinching, as the word of God so often is. But the prophecy of Malachi seems particularly to employ this particular method of communication, to say, you need to listen to this message. There's no room for moving to the one side. This is really, really direct and critical. And the condemnation which the prophet, the Spirit through the prophet uses, is repeatedly given. Now, the first question, of course, to whom is it directed? Well, the obvious answer is of course, to Israel of old, to Judah in particular, as our title suggests. As we pick up from verse 11 of chapter 2, Judah hath dealt treacherously. It's to Judah of old, of course it is. But isn't it also to us? Isn't this a communication from the Spirit that we should listen also, in whichever generation we might find ourselves? We'd be foolish in the extreme, wouldn't we, to imagine that we had nothing to learn, no lessons to observe from this message of the prophet. The risk is very often, it seems to me, guilty as charged, I might say, that, well, that was Israel, that's not me, that's not us. And we can, as it were, put to one side that criticism, that condemnation, and imagine it's all for another party without taking careful thought for ourselves. So that's something that I think will come out once and again as we progress this evening. So what do we know of the time period? We know the time period is after the exile, don't we? We know, well, we're confident at least, that this is in the period of Nehemiah. It probably sits in the period between chapters 12 and 13 of Nehemiah. We know how Nehemiah went away from Jerusalem and returned. And it appears, broadly speaking, that the prophecy of Malachi seems to sit in that particular period. And we'll see some links to Nehemiah very soon, and as we go on with our talk. There are some common phrases which come up through the prophecy of Malachi, and this theme of repetition so often used through the Hebrew scriptures, isn't it? And these phrases crop up from time to time. We see perhaps from chapter 1, it's about I, because it's God, the Spirit, speaking through the prophet Malachi. Verse 2 of chapter 1, I have loved you. And verse 6, if I then be a father, where is mine honour? And if I be a master, where is my fear? And the identity of God, the Spirit through the prophet Malachi, is repeatedly expressed. And if you haven't already got it noted, it's worth just looking for the expression, my name. So you see it in verse 6, you see it in this is chapter 1, verse 6, you see it in verse 11 of chapter 1, several times at the end of chapter 1, my name. This is about the honor of God's name and what God's name represents. It's an identity of the creator of the heavens and of the earth. It represents him and all of his attributes, seen so beautifully in Exodus 34, of course. And another relatively common word is just a sort of first comment, chapter 2 and verse 9 says, therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people. That word contemptible, we see it in chapter 1 also at verse 6, and it's the word despise. And we see it further on excuse me, at verse 7 and verse 13, where again it's the word contemptible. So we have this idea of contempt, of despising, which is the despising or the contempt with which Judah held God's worship in. That same contempt is going to be poured out, as it were, upon the nation. So the way in which they viewed God was the way in which God viewed them. And of course, the power of that, the impact of that shouldn't be lost on us, should it? Now, as we go on in chapter 2 at verse 10, as we started our reading, have we not all one Father? Hath not one God created us? So there's commonality of descent that's being spoken of here, isn't there? We see how we have one Father, we're of the same parentage, commonality of descent. And it's a theme of the scriptures, isn't it? The Jews, it seems to perceive themselves as being better, holier than, separate from, an elevated position. Well, that was justified to some degree on account of the revelation of the oracles of God, as we know. But they despised in that process the Gentiles. And that's not really how God works. And we know the principles of that come through with the teaching of the Lord Jesus Christ, the apostles, through the New Testament. How the gospel is open to all, and it's to whosoever. It is to Jew and Gentile, because God's promise is in that degree of universal offering. Not that it is going to be universal, I don't mean that, but the offer is to all. This is about those that be of Abraham's faith. So, commonality of descent. The responsibility which the Jews had, of course, with the revealing of the oracles of God, was that they might be a beacon to which all of the other nations could see light from, this great and wise law, and that all nations should see that they were a wise and understanding people and take knowledge that they had been with God. And that same principle really should be with us as well, shouldn't it? Is there a recognition that we are holding the truth, that others might take knowledge of us and come to know the God of the Bible? Well, if we continue thinking around chapter 2 and verse 10, why do we deal, notice the way in which the prayer is, or the theme is put, it's the we deal treacherously every man against his brother by profaning the covenant of our fathers. And the idea is that of oppression, isn't it? This is those with power and authority holding in contempt others over whom they have power and are exploiting them. Keep your marker in Malachi, and turn with me, if you wouldn't mind, to Nehemiah's writings. These are Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Nehemiah, and it's chapter 5 of Nehemiah that we want. So we know that this is the same broad period. We're talking after the exile. Nehemiah 5 and verse 1, there was a great cry of the people and of their wives against their brethren, the Jews, for there were that said, we, our sons and our daughters are many, therefore we take up corn for them that we may eat and live. And there's a further grouping in verse 3, who mortgaged their lands and their vineyards that they might buy corn. And verse 4, there are another group who had borrowed money for the king's tribute, for the Persian taxation. But notice this in verse 5, yet now our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren. See the similarity of language. Our children as their children, and lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants, and some of our daughters are brought into bondage already, neither is it in our power to redeem them. And Nehemiah appropriately is angry in verse 6 and goes on to remonstrate with them, setting a great assembly, and condemns them for selling and exploiting their brethren. But see that commonality of descent idea. See how our flesh is as the flesh of our brethren. It was wholly inappropriate to exploit their fellow man, let alone of the same tribe and nation. And that same theme comes up in the writings of James, epistle of James, and it's worth just having a quick peep at this. Chapter 5 of James opens, go to now, ye rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. Your riches are corrupted, gold and silver cankered. You've heaped together treasure for the last days. But notice these words, verse 4 of James 5, behold the hire of the labourers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. So they were exploiting their fellow man. They were using slave labour, as it were. They were withholding the appropriate payment that they might indeed live in pleasure, and so on, as verse 5 goes on to say. Verse 6, ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doth not resist you. So that's the condemnation which James uses, similar sort of language as we see both in Nehemiah and in Malachi chapter 2 and verse 10. So what does he say in the middle of verse 10? Why do we deal treacherously, every man against his brother? And we see that the word treacherously occurs 5 times through this chapter, obviously here in verse 10, but also then in verse 11, in verse 14, it's in verse 15, and also verse 16. And the idea is to cover, to do something discreetly or secretly, to cover as with a garment, says Strong's Concordance, which is interesting when we actually look at that in verse 16, in the context of God hating putting away, for one covereth violence with his garment. They're different words, but that same concept seems to be presented in verse 16, this covering with a garment, to act covertly, deceitfully, unfaithfully, with hypocrisy. We know the words. It's to say one thing and do something else. It's to play a part, to act, but with the intention to deceive. And we can sense the power of that, can't we, deeply enough. And the verse goes on to say about profaning the covenant of our fathers. Which covenant is he speaking of? Well, it's effectively the covenant at Sinai, isn't it? And from which the Mosaic Code stems. They had transgressed its stipulations. Everything that was there in that law was about loving the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind, and thy neighbour as thyself. You can't exploit your fellow worker and your fellow man if you're showing love to him, can you? The two don't go together. So there's a really strident condemnation by Malachi of the people, and surely we have to take heed of this also. It can't be a message just for 2,500 years ago. Well, the theme of treachery and profanation continues into verse 11, and we see the word abomination. It's something hateful and disgusting. Now, as we read verse 11, it says, an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord, which he loved, and hath married the daughter of a strange god. And despite what I was saying earlier on about Malachi being a relatively easy and straightforward read, actually this verse is a little bit, well, maybe less easy to follow through. But I suggest to you there's a parallelism going on. The holiness which is spoken of here, the holiness of the Lord, is Jerusalem and the place of the temple, that they're put as parallel statements. It's the place where God chose to place his name. It's the place where he was to be worshipped and glorified. But they had married the daughter of a strange god. And again, this is idiomatic language where there is an association between the deity and the worshipper. There is a father-son relationship, a parent-child relationship between the deity and the worshipper. And Israel should have been married to Yahweh, but they had become associated with strange gods. They had shown themselves to be unfaithful. And so verse 12 continues, the Lord will cut off the man that doeth this, the master and the scholar, out of the tabernacles of Jacob, and him that offereth an offering unto the Lord of hosts. Again, this is an idiomatic expression, not necessarily terribly easy to work out. The language seems to be the waker and him that is woken. It's the one speaking and the one listening, as it were, at the same time. And it's maybe a little bit like those idiomatic expressions that we find in the scriptures, him that is shut up and left in Israel. It's embracing everybody. It's to go out and to come in. They're idiomatic expressions. None is excluded from this. The Lord will cut off all that do this. Judgment is going to be executed, and though it seems to tarry, it will come, as we shall see. So verse 13 goes on, and this have ye done again, covering the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with crying out, insomuch that he regardeth not the offering any more, or receiveth it with goodwill at your hand. The emphasis seems to be again. It is a second offence. It is a repeat. But we might ask, well, what's wrong with the sentiment of mourning and weeping, of being sorrowful for the situation or for transgression? Is penitence not appropriate. Well, I think the issue is what's being said here is not probably genuine. There's a possibility that it's referring to the cry of the women who have been put away by those that are dealing treacherously. Certainly that's a possibility. That's quite a reasonable suggestion and line of thought. But it could equally be the hollow and false mourning of those that are coming to make their offering, because it's a pretense, it's a show, it's hypocrisy. Well, there's a spirit of humility that's required, certainly. I don't think I can think of a place in the scriptures where God instructs his people to weep before him as such. It wasn't part of the offering process. Humility, as I say, certainly. Soberness, yes. A realization that sin has been committed, certainly. But really, it's about gratefulness of pardon, isn't it? That's the spirit which comes through the offerings of the law. But with this idea of weeping, I'm minded to think of the statement in Ezekiel chapter 8. Probably know it fairly well, but I'll just flip back to it. Ezekiel chapter 8, chapter 9, that won't help. Chapter 8 and verse 14. It's the abominations that are found in Jerusalem. Verse 13, he said also unto me, turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations that they do. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. This is false worship. This is Ashtaroth. This is Astarte, or whichever of those false gods you want to suppose. Idol worship, a weeping of entirely the wrong order. But God is not willing to receive this sort of false weeping, contrived, hypocritical offering. Now, verse 14 goes on, yet ye say, wherefore? And this combination, yet ye say, what, wherefore, wherein, occurs 9 times in this particular combination. There's a 10th, which is slightly different. So, yet ye say, wherefore? What is the sort of style of this? There is ignorance. They are incredulous. What about affronted? You can't mean this. That seems to be the reaction of the people to the words of Malachi. But the prophet goes on, because the Lord hath been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously. So again, that expression of hypocrisy, deceit, play acting. Yet is she thy companion, and the wife of thy covenant. There had been treachery in oppressing of one's neighbour. There was treachery in the worshipping of other gods. There was treachery in putting away their wives, and 3 times it occurs in this section. The strength and the power of this, again, shouldn't be lost on us. And there is one man, and there is one wife. She is thy companion. It is a singular relationship which is here. And it's representative, of course, isn't it, of the relationship which God has with his people. There is a covenant relationship between the God of all the earth and his people and those that will turn to him. And that covenant is there between man and wife, isn't it? Therefore shall a man leave father and mother, and so on, as we have it in the Genesis record. But God could have made any number of wives for Adam. Verse 15, did he not make one? Why did he only make one? Because he was seeking a godly seed. There was to be no confusion. This was the provision of the seed who would come. So take heed to your spirit, take heed to yourselves. Let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. That the power and the strength of this, again, should not be wasted on us. The Lord, verse 16, the God of Israel saith, that he hateth putting away. For the hardness of your hearts, the Lord says, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement. But from the beginning it was not so, isn't it? That's the language of the Lord. Because this indicates that there is a breaking of a covenant, a breaking of a vow. Treachery is not allowed. So going on to verse 17, he says, ye have wearied the Lord with your words. And again, this repeated expression, I think this is the fifth in the series, yet ye say, wherein have we wearied him? And the response comes from the prophet, when ye say, every one that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delighteth in them. Or as an alternative, where is the God of judgment? Because I don't believe, say they, that the God of judgment really is going to come and perform. So what happens? Wherein have we wearied him? Everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord. Have a look with me at, again, Nehemiah 13. And I think we can sense here the way in which Tobiah is being referenced in this sort of language. Nehemiah chapter 13 and reading verse 4. And we know how outraged Nehemiah is. Before this, verse 4 of Nehemiah 13, Eliashib the priest, having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah, and he had prepared for him a great chamber, where aforetime they laid the meal offerings, the frankincense, the vessels, the tithes of the corn, the new wine, the oil which was commanded to be given to the Levites and to the singers and the porters, and the offerings for the priests. But in all this time was not I at Jerusalem. So there is outrage on the part of Nehemiah, and he, as the chapter goes on, casts out the household stuff of Tobiah. But see also earlier in Nehemiah at chapter 6 and verse 17, and we have this character Tobiah, who's one of the enemies of the people of Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 17. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent many letters unto Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came unto them. For there were many in Judah sworn unto him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Erah, and his son Johanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. Here's the words, verse 19, also they reported his good deeds before me and uttered my words to him. Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. They were imagining that Tobiah was working good, but he was evil. Verse 17 of Malachi 2, everyone that doeth evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delighteth in them. It was not so. Well, those that delight in themselves, those that do well for themselves, often are thought well of, aren't they? The psalmist says, men will praise thee when thou doest well for thyself. And we see how chapter 3 and verse 15 seems to link with this same concept. Chapter 3, verse 15, now we call the proud happy. Yea, they that work wickedness are set up. Yea, they that tempt God are even delivered. And so there seems to be this, where is the God of judgment? Well, nothing's happening. These people that you say are wicked, actually, they're doing well for themselves. And there is an association between material blessings, as it were, and being righteous. And that's a dangerous line to go down. It was part of the problem of Job's three friends, wasn't it? That bad things happen to bad people, and good things, by which are often wrongly attributed material things, come to those that do good. But it isn't that way. It isn't that straightforward. So where is the God of judgment? It doesn't work out according to my expectation. Therefore, I disbelieve. Seems to be the spirit of what's going on here. Well, the God of judgment was indeed coming. Chapter 3 and verse 1, he was going to come suddenly, not so much immediately, but unexpectedly. He was going to come to his temple. And there are two messengers here in chapter 3 and verse 1. There is the messenger who goes before to proclaim the way. And of course, it speaks of John the Baptist as it's picked up for us by the Lord in the New Testament. And then there is the messenger of the covenant proper, Christ the Lord himself. Would seem to be a fairly straightforward reading of that verse. Well, who may abide the day of his coming, verse 2, and who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire and like fuller's soap. There is a certainty about the working of God, isn't there? It works according to his time scale, not necessarily ours or our perception of it. But with our advantaged viewpoint, this point, we can look back in history and see how God has worked. We can see the destruction of Jerusalem. We can see the dispersion of the nation. We can see that things have worked out according to the prophetic word, and we should be confident on that basis of the way in which God has worked and yet will work according to his time scale, as I say, not necessarily ours. And we see this lovely layered imagery in verses 2 and 3. It is fuller's soap, the cleaner, the person doing the laundry, as it were, and also the refiner and the purifier of silver. These two aspects, the washing of water and the purging by fire. Now, with these couple of ideas that come through in verse 3, where it's talking about the purifying of the sons of Levi, there's another interesting allusion back to Nehemiah. It's just worth going back there. I should have said keep a finger there. Been useful if I'd done the same. Nehemiah and chapter 13 again. So just a little further on from where we were considering a moment ago. Nehemiah 13, and it's verse 7. He casts out the household stuff, verse 8 of Tobiah, out of the chamber, and we see how verse 9, then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meal offering and the frankincense. So we see how cleansing is made, purification is made, so that there could be brought in the various things that were needful for the worship of God. So that's reading from verse 9 onwards, and we see then the appointment of the priests, which follows later on in that chapter. Back in Malachi, chapter 3 and verse 4. Then, so when this purgation has taken place, when this refining has been accomplished, then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former years. Cleansing took place in the time of Nehemiah. It will yet again take place. And we see then, as we read on into verse 5, how there is a correspondence of ideas for the condemnation against those that had put away their wives and formed adulterous relationships, against those who were treacherous, against those that were deceitful, against those that were oppressing their fellows. Do you see the same language is there in verse 5? Against the adulterers, against the false swearers, against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow and the fatherless, that turn aside the stranger from his right. As we've said at the outset, this is strident language, and we do well to be sure of listening and paying attention to it. And we're probably reminded with the language of that verse of what we read in James chapter 1 about pure religion and undefiled before God is this: to visit the fatherless, to relieve the oppressed, the reverse of what we see here in Malachi 3 and verse 5. Verse 6, God says, I change not. You see, I'm faithful, says God. What I say will be so. He made a covenant. The nation is beloved for the father's sakes. The covenant which he made with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And on account of this covenant, ye sons of Jacob are not consumed. All Israel, natural and spiritual, shall be saved. Well, it required an action on the part of the people. We see as we go on into verse 7 that he says, return, the middle of the verse, return unto me, and I will return unto you. We see how the responsibility was on the part of the people. It's the responsibility on us to first begin that process of return. We can think of the prodigal son, can't we? The father was looking for him all of the time, but yet it required motivation and action on the part of the son to make his way back towards the father. Return unto me, and God assures that he will then respond. But they said, "Wherein shall we return?" What do you mean? They were ignorant and affronted. And there's always the danger, a very real danger, that that same could be true for us. Will a man rob God? Well, of course, it's faintly ridiculous, isn't it? You can't rob God. Oh, but you can. By failing to provide for those who are doing the worship and the obligations that were placed upon them for the tithes, for the support of the priests and so on. And that same support is needed for those that are faithfully doing the work of God. And though times were tough, verse 10, bring the tithes into the storehouse. When things are tough, then it may be that the willingness to give the tithe was less willingly done. The temptation to hold back would be greater. But God assures that if they act in faith, he will, as it were, open the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing. And it's a different time period, but the principle remains the same. We see something similar in the days of Hezekiah in Isaiah 37. We don't have time to begin looking at that. And so as we start to round off our comments, we see at verse 11, I will rebuke the devourer. The devourer in this context is probably the locust, but we see that God says, I will rebuke. And it's another one of those repetitions that goes through the prophecy of Malachi, that I will do so and so. God says, I will send. God says, I will come near. God says, I will be a swift witness, and so on and so on. And ultimately, the final one of that sequence is chapter 4 and verse 5. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, that same messenger that we saw at the beginning of chapter 3. Well, we're not going to make any particular comment. The last couple of verses, they had distorted perspectives, didn't they? They imagined one thing, but actually it wasn't so. What have we spoken so much against thee? Well, the criticism was strong and real. The power is there for us to consider by way of exhortation for ourselves. We would be, as I say, churlish and foolish in the extreme to imagine that these things couldn't apply to us. Going through the form, going through the ritual, but not touching the heart, it's a real problem, isn't it? We can deceive ourselves. We have that uncanny ability. Let us hope and pray that the Spirit word can so affect our minds that we might follow in the right way consistently, so that we might be amongst those who, to steal a couple of words from the next section, might be those who fear Yahweh, speaking often one to another, that we might be amongst the jewels and be found worthy of him.